Welcome to Never Rewrite. I'm Isaac Askew.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman, and today we're joined by special guest Erik Enge, who is the COO of Ghost, and he leads engineering and other functions. And he's going to talk to us today about creating a culture of continuous improvement and just how you would go about doing it, how you would measure it, how you would track it. And I am super excited because I have worked in wonderful environments and I've worked in terrible environments, but I've never worked at an environment that was actively working to make itself better in a rational way, like a scientific kind of way. Like if it happened, like been at places where it happened, but it was almost by accident or just by throwing stuff at the wall. So Erik, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Okay. So I guess lay it on us. What's the secret? How do you go about creating an environment for continuous improvement?
So the how of it is really specific to the culture in which you want to do this and will vary all the time. But maybe what I can do first is kind of describe a little bit more in the abstract what it is and sort of what some of the core principles of it are. And then maybe we can dig into and how do you do that in a business setting.
Yeah.
So, at the heart of this, it feels good to say that there's almost nothing new. One way of looking at this is to say what we're trying to do here is we're trying to apply the scientific method in a business context. And we're trying to think of the things we do as experiments, as hypotheses. And then once we execute that, whether that's shipping a change or making an organizational change or running a program on our teams, whatever that might be, then we reflect on how it went. And then we incorporate the learning from the reflection into the next conversation, which is, all right, and what's the next step we take? So, like at the most basic, that's what it's about. Operationalizing that at the team level, at the department level, at the company level is where the rubber meets the road often.
Right, because what you're describing, in theory, that sounds like how Agile is supposed to work, right? You do some work, and after you do the work, you have a retro, and you talk about what went well and what went badly and what you should change and what you should do next time. And then typically, then you never look at that document again. And then you go on and you do more or less the same thing for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's right. So I think it's broadly speaking true to say that we lost our way. We lost the plot along our agile journey. And at this point, it's the most commonly for me, what I see is performative. A team will do a retro without really understanding that this is the reflection portion of a learning loop. And so it becomes performative. It's something we do. Okay, we talked about some nice things. Now we go back to work. But really, the secret sauce is to incorporate daily improvement as daily work. And so how do you call... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So how do you do that? Like let's say you're starting from a company or starting at a place where you've got the minimal, people are going through the actions without understanding them, and so they're getting no value out of them. But let's say you're doing 2-week sprints and you have the retro and you come up with ideas or hypotheses for things that you should do next time. How do you actually get the rubber to meet the road there?
Yeah, so this is where the context really, really matters, and the answer will be different for different teams. But one thing that I see teams miss out on the most is that the whole learning loop is predicated on having something to compare against. And this is why if you start a sprint and you say, well, we can do 12 points, let's do these 3 tasks, and then you execute that, you ship it, at the end, what could we have done better? Well, what could we have done better against what? And so a practice that a lot of teams don't do is they don't create the hypothesis at the beginning. And so we can say, well, we think we're going to affect user activation by 2 percentage points by shipping these 3 tasks. Okay, go ahead and do them, ship them. Now reflect. Did it move that needle in that way? And obviously the metric here can be whatever you want. Happier developers, happier customers, more velocity, whatever it is. But if you don't take the time to create your hypothesis, you have nothing to hinge off of. And the bias is often, well, we did it, so I guess it was good. And then it becomes a little anemic in terms of like creating opportunities. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite examples around this is how the U.S. nuclear reactor program was developed in the 60s when nuclear science wasn't even a thing. And so the admiral running that program, he caused that to be the predominant way of working in that program. Create a prediction, create a hypothesis of what will happen. Let's say,
Okay.
okay, this reactor should only emit 300 whatever units of radiation. Anything under 300 is safe. And then perform the experiment, the measurement. And if the actual is different, whether it's good or bad, right? Maybe the
Mm-hmm.
reactor emitted less radiation than what you thought. If the actual is different, there's a gap in your mental model about what should have happened, and you need
Mm-hmm.
to, and there is your learning opportunity. And so it's the same for our engineering team, our marketing team, our sales teams. If we think about daily work, what we do as hypothesis, if we take a moment to put a stake in the sand and say, well, based on the best knowledge we have today, we think this is going to happen. And then you do it, now you have a point of reflection.
If
That's
you've
it.
got multiple like hypotheses going and the feedback loop is like longer than your retro would be, how do you keep up with multiple like experiments? So say you have a 2 week sprint and you have a retro at the end, but you won't really know if your thing worked until 3 months of data have been collected. Do you have
Mm-hmm.
like 8 running at the same time and you're hoping that by the fourth sprint you'll have some data to reflect on your first sprint's work, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I mean, sometimes it's kind of like that, where the metric we want to move is bigger and takes a longer time to affect. Um, the skillfulness then is in setting smaller goals, and so let's say we have a 2 week sprint. We don't say by the end of that 2 week sprint what we think will happen is we will have reached our goal on the metric, but find some other thing that is a proxy for that, or that feels like a meaningful milestone on the way to that to measure. So
Hmm.
maybe it's okay. So we made some UX improvements around the feature. Maybe it's an onboarding process that we think our hypothesis is it's too frictionful. If it was less frictionful, we would onboard 20% more customers or whatever. Then make a hypothesis about the piece you are doing in that sprint and ship that.
Gotcha. So just cutting all your expectations into little bite-sized pieces to make them more easily measurable.
Yeah, and if I can take just so we've talked about the team level for a minute, but if I
Mm-hmm.
can connect this to like how individuals can do this for themselves too.
Please.
Um, so let's just take engineers. If I'm going to work, let's say I have an 8 hour day and I have some meetings, and I think today I'm going to do about 4 hours of deep programming work. Cool. And then at the start of that day, I create a goal for myself and a hypothesis. Well, today, based on all of my best knowledge, I think I can ship this change to, let's say, the API endpoint handling. Um, and then I do that, and then at the end of the day, I reflect, well, how did it go? Well, maybe it didn't go that way, as it often happens. And what I learned was the end to end test for this thing is way slow and flaky, actually. And now I need to incorporate that learning into the next step I take. Now, of course,
Hmm.
this is a component of some almost certainly much higher business goal, but we can take bite-sized pieces like this, and it in our industry, I would say setting deadlines is like instills fears in a lot of people, and for
It's
good
terrible.
reason. Yeah, we've been very dysfunctional around deadlines, even calling them deadline. But it can be a useful constraint to find improvement opportunities. And so, if you can use it in a functional way that way, you can say, "This is what I think I can do in a day. Here's what I actually got done in a day. Now, why? Why 4 hours
Hmm.
ago was I wrong about that? And how can I learn?" It's just a step in the learning loop.
Hmm. I really like the idea of just that not necessarily informal, but the idea of you write down what you think is going to happen, you do your work, you look back at the end of the day and say, well, what happened? That's actually really sounds really effective.
It can be. If I can jump to something else that Isaac touched on that I think is a,
Mm-hmm.
I would say it's separate, but it really goes hand in hand with how to build this kind of culture. You said multiple hypotheses, Isaac, and this may not be how you meant it, but if one team is running multiple hypotheses, I would go be curious about that. So what comes in for me is queuing theory and process theory. If we have a team of 8 engineers and they're running 8 hypotheses, let's say, I would say it sounds like we have priorities and goals at the individual level, not at the team level.
Mm.
And in general, it's going to be faster to have 8 people collaborate towards one hypothesis than to have 8 people own individual hypotheses. And the reason for that often is the flow gets all jumbled up and they stop on each other. One day Isaac is ready to take the next step, but now he's blocked on Jeffrey because only Jeffrey can change those end-to-end tests. So now we get staggered that way. So having an appreciation for what we now call flow, queuing theory, process theory, going back to the earliest, like The Goal by Goldratt and Product Development Flow by Reinhardt. That's a little bit of something that I passionately think needs to come back in engineering and company leadership.
I think that's a really interesting and great point about if you have a team of 8 people and you have 8 hypotheses going, you really have 8 individuals under one manager who aren't really a team.
Yeah, and the implication is, how long is it going to get results from the 8 hypotheses? Well, let's just say it's going to take 4 months, okay? How many of those are going to be wrong? We don't know. But what we do know is that in 4 months is our earliest point when we can incorporate new learning to update our mental models about the world. It is going to be almost certainly better to have 8 of those people work on one hypothesis so that we get to learn sooner, because invariably our mental models are outdated and in the stage of becoming more outdated because customers and the world is changing around us.
Right. Yeah, I like that because I think a lot of the teams, I guess the multiple hypotheses thing I was thinking of is I definitely have had teams try to run different experiments at the same time to see if this change has led to different conversions and that kind of thing. And the traffic was too low to really gauge anything meaningful within like a short time frame. So therefore, a retro on it, you could glean some statistics, but you didn't know how statistically relevant it would be. So that's why people would do multiple over a long period of time. But to your point, so much can change in 3 months, 6 months, and doing like smaller goals, or at least trying to kind of guess what that particular goal divided by a shorter time frame would be to go ahead and make an action or to call something a success or reflect on it faster would definitely, like, just shorter and faster feedback loops just feels better intuitively, I think, to me, than trying to see what happens in 6 months, because so many things could happen outside in the world changing around us in 6 months that are unrelated to your change as an experiment. Just economically, they could have changed, and so you're basing your stats on some other, like COVID happening. So much. How do you say it's statistically relevant to some other thing you did when it was such a big event that would have shaken all of your stats up? So those tiny loops, I really like the idea of.
I think that's a really good point, Isaac. Nobody could have necessarily predicted all the things that'll, in retrospect, seem obvious that it had an impact. And so having shorter learning loops to optimize for learning is part of the key. If you like, I can give you a concrete example.
Love it.
So this was when I was leading Postmark Ad Active campaign. We were developing a feature that would allow customers to change the retention of the emails within Postmark. By default, it was 45 days. And our hypothesis was some of our bigger customers would like more time, retention of 365 days for GDPR reasons and things like that. So we did customer interviews. We built a hypothesis around this. We found confidence. Then we built a financial model for what we thought this thing was going to do when we shipped it. And so we built the feature, we shipped it. And then to your point, Isaac, the team moved on to other activities because this thing was going to play out over the next 3 to 6 months in terms of adoption of it, right? So, and just as a tangent, I think we're missing a word for this in our engineering culture. We have like the backlog, where things come from, but I think we kind of need like a front log where things go to for evaluation and reflection after we ship them. But right now, they kind of just drop off a cliff and we don't think about it. We just pick up the next thing from the backlog.
There
So
should be a
this is
word
like,
for that.
yeah, it should be, right? And but
Yeah.
this is kind of a version where we put into the quote unquote front log, and I'm sure that's the wrong term for it, but and then our PM was reflecting on how was adoption versus our model. And now, if we didn't have the model that we built beforehand, we would look at adoption and we would say, awesome, this is a huge success. Customers are adopting it. It's adding revenue. It's all the things we hope for. But because we had put our predictions in writing like that, we were able to see that, you know what? The interesting thing is the small customers are buying huge retention. The large customers aren't. That's exact opposite of what we thought. Long story short, one of the insights we mined from that opportunity was the account owners in Postmark for small businesses are the decision makers in those businesses. And so when we send them a newsletter, they read it and they can incorporate that into their choices. The account owners for the large businesses are IT administrators that aren't the decision makers and are ignoring the newsletter. So we through that we found we have a gap in how to talk to big customers. So that's an
It's a great
example of
finding. Yeah.
That's really good.
no way we could have predicted to find that or hypothesis that that would have been the learning ahead of time. Completely unknown.
Well, what's interesting there is if you had simply made a hypothesis that if you build this feature, then revenue will increase because people will use it. And if you had simply put a revenue number in there, the fact that the opposite customers from what you expected use it might have slipped by you entirely. Like,
Right.
oh, well, we thought this would increase revenue 10%. It increased revenue 10%. Wonderful. It did exactly what we thought, even though
There's more learnings to be had.
yeah.
Exactly. So in the bigger context of how do you do this in a company, it's like that. It's practices of declaring, reflecting at the individual level, at the team level, and wherever you're setting goals, essentially.
Love it.
I want to bring it back to something that we find near and dear, right? The idea of never rewrite and the learning loops that you're talking about. And one of the things that we talk about when we actually do one about rewriting is when you do a rewrite, you are backloading all the risk because you have this long learning cycle, right? You have to write a new system and then get it in front of the customers, and then you start learning again. Whereas if you do the opposite, which we call feces shipping, iterative development, where you're constantly deploying, but you've always only got the one system, you still have those short learning cycles where you can continue to learn and reflect and go. And I guess I've now led the witness. But how do you feel about like the idea of does a rewrite kind of rob you of the ability to have a learning cycle?
Not necessarily, because you can still structure it as a set of experiments from which to reflect. But so as someone who has done a huge rewrite, as someone who has advocated for and then led a team through a huge rewrite, I'm firmly in the camp of almost certainly never rewrite.
We should have you back on to talk about that story.
I'm happy to. So I think most commonly it's of slightly different variety. Most commonly, in my experience anyway, it has been the engineering team has learned a whole bunch from writing version 1, let's say, right?
Mm-hmm.
They feel themselves being more competent, looking back at their work going, oh my gosh, why did we do it that way? It's a complicated design. Now we know so much more about our business domain. If we had only known that, we wouldn't have done the schema that way. Things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there can often also be a component of, and oh, by the way, there's this new shiny thing out, this new framework. We didn't have it when we did this originally. We can see how much time it's going to save us. The vibe kind of comes often from that place. But I think the fallacy and why rewrites often fail is, but it's the same humans applying the same process. And the process by which version 1 came about was flawed because version 1 is no longer desirable. It has all the negative qualities that we describe about it.
Mm-hmm.
Unless we change our process, version 2 is going to have similar flaws. And so like one version of that might be, okay, let's say the team does no retros, for instance, or let's say the team doesn't have a practice of knowledge sharing, and so they're building knowledge silos, or maybe they don't have a strong culture of code review and asking each other, is my code clean? Whatever the things we don't like about V1, I believe can be traced back to the process of how V1 came about. So
Mm-hmm.
if a rewrite is proposed with someone very insightfully saying, and here's why, we tracked it back to how we work, then at least I would be quite interested in hearing about it. But if that isn't part of the conversation, my bias would be, I don't think you know why V1 ended up where it ended up.
There's something I was kind of thinking of too as you were talking about like the lessons learned from how you approached, like from the recent experiment, like you were talking to larger business owners differently than smaller business owners, and that kind of got me thinking as you're talking about like the rewrite cycle for very old code. You might lose a lot of that context of why those decisions were originally made, even if you have a good understanding now of the business domain. You might go through and say, well, why in the world is this here? Or what did we do this for? Because those things were built 8 years ago and they served a particular purpose at the time. Like we had to solve for this problem that might still be very relevant. But as you're rewriting, it's so far in the future and you're going, we don't need that anymore. And you lose that because that wasn't, maybe you didn't even have the same process of documenting, like especially when you're talking about having changes in processes or improving your process over time. So you don't even know why that decision was made or why that parity needs to be kept. And I've had, decisions for, do we really need that anymore? Do we need to support that anymore? And you run into similar issues where suddenly that feature's gone and like, oh, now we know the people who were using that, why it was there. That was 7 years ago we made the decision and no one ever wrote that down. So there's the little things that can slip between the cracks. And it just kind of
Yeah.
reminded me of that when you were saying there's discoverables in that process too that can kind of sneak in.
And tying that back to how we work. So, in domain-driven design, we talk about ubiquitous language and naming things in the databases, in the code, in the same language that our marketing, sales, customers, in their terminology, so we're on the same page. In your example, like, why did we name it this way? And if that hinges on a person in the past who's no longer here knowing the answer, then we have failed to keep the system up to date with the current language of,
Right.
and if the team doesn't become aware of that, they're going to repeat that mistake for V2. They're just going to name it what makes obvious sense today and move on and not build in a practice for going, you know what, we call this thing user now, not account. Let's go back and take a 1 week refactoring session to update everything to that.
Right.
Yes. I think this is awesome. Erik, if people wanted to get in touch with you or learn more about Ghost, how would they do so?
So they can go to ghost.org. Ghost is a nonprofit. We're open source, and we're building software for independent publishers, local newsrooms, journalists. Some of our customers are 404 Media, Platformer, things like that. And it's essentially a platform for building your own brand, as opposed to some of our competitors where you are an author on their brand. If you want to contact me, you can hit me up on LinkedIn.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.